In J.R.R. Tolkien's classic story, The Lord of the Rings, the lives of ordinary hobbits, dwarves, and elves are thrown into turmoil after the discovery of a magical ring. The characters fight over it because it'll make the one who wears it invisible and give him the ability to control people as well as the other 3 rings. Some, like Gollum, want the ring for selfish purposes and are even willing to kill for it. Others, like the hobbit Frodo, are noble and want to use it for good. But as it turns out, the ring is inherently evil and will corrupt anyone who wears it, even those with the best intentions. Now, even though The Lord of the Rings is fantasy fiction, it's based on real-life human weaknesses. It dramatizes important truths about the pitfalls of power and the fallibility of human nature. But it begs the question, if power is inherently corrupting and no one is immune to its temptations, how can we mere mortals set up a government where sinful men rule over other sinful men? America's founding fathers faced this question when they set up our nation. Their study of history and human nature had taught them that the struggle to acquire power and the question of how to control it has dominated humanity since the beginning of time. They knew that, more often than not, it had been used for selfish reasons and to dominate other people and nations. For instance, the promise of godlike power to know good and evil is what tempted Adam and Eve to disobey God in the Garden of Eden. Fears of Caesar's abuse of power eventually led to his assassination. England's 12-year-old King Edward V and his 9-year-old brother were apparently murdered in the Tower of London by their uncle in the 1400s in an effort to secure the throne for himself. In fact, it was the founders' own experiences living under a tyrannical British monarchy that caused them to fight for independence in the first place. With such a lousy history, we really can't blame the founders for their fear of an oppressive government and for overcompensating for it when they created our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. But they soon discovered that too little power could be as dangerous as too much of it. The federal government was so limited and weak that states ignored it without consequence. It was so ineffective that it couldn't collect taxes or even raise an army, and states acted more like independent countries than part of a unified nation. Chaos threatened our national security and ability to survive as a new country. Eventually, it became clear that the Articles of Confederation weren't working, and the founders decided to call a convention to address the problem. This time, they didn't seek to get rid of power or completely avoid any federal government. Instead, they outsmarted the problem of power by developing a system that accounted for its irresistible allure and harnessed people's selfish, greedy tendencies. After months of discussion, debate, and study, they created Articles 1 through 7 of the Constitution we know today. They've been protecting our rights for over 200 years. Article 1 protects us against the abuse of power by ensuring that the government answers to the people. It sets up the first of the 3 branches of the federal government, a legislature made up of a House and Senate. It includes the authority to create new laws, levy taxes, declare war, impeach officials, and approve treaties. It's no accident that Article 1 is the longest of the 7 articles. The founders gave the most powers to Congress because it's directly accountable to the people. They hoped that as citizens, we would serve as the main check and balance on Congress by rewarding the representatives' good work with re-election or by voting them out if they neglect their constituents or abuse their powers. Because of this, Congress must be very responsive to the people or risk losing their jobs. Article 2 establishes the executive branch and outlines the president's responsibilities. First and foremost, his job is to make sure the law is carried out. But he's also the commander-in-chief of the military and has the power to sign or veto laws that come to his desk, negotiate treaties with foreign countries, appoint federal judges and fill vacancies in other federal positions, and grant pardons for crimes. The president's job is important, but if you actually read Article 2, it's surprisingly short, especially for the leader of the free world. That's because the framers wanted to make it clear that the president is not a king. Instead, his abilities are limited and defined, and several are even checked by other branches of government. For example, his appointment power hinges on the Senate's advice and consent, and although he's head of the military, only Congress can declare war. The framers put these checks and balances in place to deter tyrannical tendencies and make sure that our rights are safe from the agenda of any one person. Article 3 created the judicial branch, and understanding what its job isn't is just as important as understanding what it is. The role of the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts is not to dream up laws or invent rights or reflect the popular trends of the day. Instead, the job of the court is to discern whether or not laws meet the criteria of the Constitution. This is because the founders wanted to protect us from an unelected ruling class trying to create laws. Only Congress has been given the power to legislate. The Supreme Court is also an important check on the other two branches of government, and a reminder that no one, no matter their position, is above the law. Article 4 is the adhesive that holds the nation together. It guarantees a Republican form of government to every state and promises federal protection from foreign invasion and civil unrest. It prevents any one state from overpowering another by declaring that each must honor each other's laws, records, and court rulings, and promises that people visiting from another state have the same rights as permanent residents. A defined relationship between the states, a national military, and a single foreign policy unites the states into one nation that presents a strong face to the watching world. This helped eliminate much of the chaos that arose from states having absolute independence under the Articles of Confederation, and was a big step toward allowing America to survive as an independent nation. Article 5 provides a game plan for changing the Constitution. The founders knew that over the years, issues would come up that they could not foresee, so they provided a way to amend the Constitution. But they also wanted to protect the Constitution from being torn apart by fads or power-hungry individuals. So they created an amendment process, but one that's intentionally difficult in order to protect our rights from reckless upheaval. Therefore, amendments may be proposed by a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, or 2/3 of state legislatures can ask Congress to call a convention to amend the Constitution. Amendments must then be approved by a majority of the states. 27 amendments have been added to the original 7 articles. In fact, the latest amendment was added in 1992, just 6 years before I was born. Article 6 defines the relationship between the state and national governments. In the Supremacy Clause, the founders made it clear that federal law takes precedence over state law when the two conflict. Article 6 combines the concept of state sovereignty with the stability of one nation united under the Constitution. It also makes it clear that all government officials owe their first loyalty to the U.S. Constitution and must swear to uphold it. This drove home the idea that in America, the law is king, and the president, judges, Congress, and citizens are all equally under its authority. It's just one more precaution the founders put in place to protect us from the accumulation of power. Article 7 is the last of the Constitution's articles, and it's easy to overlook. But in reality, our Constitution wouldn't exist without it. The founders knew from experience that it would be almost impossible to get all 13 of America's fiercely independent states to agree on a constitution as the Articles of Confederation demanded. Frankly, it was likely to fail entirely, leaving us with no constitution at all. Rhode Island, for instance, refused to even send delegates to the convention. it was too big of a risk to take. So instead of requiring a unanimous vote to adopt the Constitution, they established that just 9 of the 13 states were needed. It was a radical move, but it's a good thing they changed it. Turns out, Rhode Island didn't sign the Constitution until 3 years later, and North Carolina abstained from voting until 1789. If it hadn't been for the founders' pragmatism and foresight, our Constitution would have fallen prey to what was basically a tyranny of the minority, and it would never have made it out of the convention. The safeguards against the abuse of power built into Articles 1 through 7 have worked together to protect citizens and their rights, and not just for the past 200 years, but even to this day. For example, in 2014, they shielded Americans from a power grab by the executive branch, just as the founders had designed them to do. 4 years earlier, a family-owned Pepsi Cola distribution plant called the Noel Canning Corporation met with the Teamsters to discuss a new bargaining contract. The Teamsters claimed they reached a consensus. The Noel Canning Corporation argued they had not. The company took the case to the National Labor Relations Board, a federal agency that resolves disputes between unions and private sector businesses. The NLRB ruled in favor of the Teamsters, but Noel challenged the ruling, stating the NLRB hadn't had a quorum when they made the decision because 3 of the 5 members were recess appointments unconstitutionally made by President Obama. According to Article 2, Section 2, Clause 3, the President can make such appointments, but only when the Senate is in recess. In this case, despite the fact that the Senate was technically in session, the President declared them in recess and unilaterally made the appointments. The President's action was a clear violation of the separation of powers. But thanks to Articles 1 through 7, the story didn't end there. With the Senate's support, Noel appealed the NLRB ruling to the D.C. Court of Appeals as established in Article 3. The court unanimously agreed with Noel Canning that President Obama's 3 recess appointments were unconstitutional, and therefore, so were all the rulings they had made during that time. But the president wasn't going to stand for that and brought his grievance to the Supreme Court. He'd be disappointed, however, because the highest court in the land ruled unanimously against him. On June 26, 2014, the Supreme Court declared President Obama's appointments an unconstitutional, unilateral power grab that ignored the Senate's authority. The NLRB's ruling was declared invalid. As Justice Stephen Breyer wrote in his majority opinion, the Senate is in session when it says that it is, and the window in which the president made his appointments did not count as an actual recess. 3 days is too short a time to bring a recess within the scope of the clause, so the president lacked the authority to make those appointments. The Supreme Court smackdown of an executive power grab is a reminder that even the president cannot violate the Constitution or bypass the Senate's responsibility to provide advice and consent in order to achieve his own goals. He's subject to the limits imposed by the Constitution, just like everyone else. Like the characters in Tolkien's novels who were bewitched and corrupted by the ring, the president gave in to temptation and abused his power. But thankfully, the checks and balances of Articles 1 through 7 worked together to protect the rights and freedoms of the Noel Canning Corporation and thousands of other private sector businesses from a potential act of tyranny, just as the framers intended. As Americans, we're incredibly blessed to live in a land where law is king and where we have a concise, written constitution to appeal to when our rights are threatened. But Articles 1 through 7 are only helpful if we know how they work and understand the philosophy behind their structure. It's crucial that we study and protect the document that so faithfully defends us. It's precious.